That giving them money doesn't lift them out of their conditions. Giving them money institutionalizes their conditions. We can look at how the New Deal affected, poverty in America. It institutionalized
You mean the New Deal
poverty.
from FDR's New Deal from the 1930s?
Yeah. That was one of the big arguments. I mean, if you look at, the incomes during that time and people pulling themselves out of poverty, people were doing pretty well during that time. Really, it was these policies that institutionalize this type of failure. And then you get generational failure because you have parents, fathers who don't pass on these values. You have mothers who can have kids and raise their kids in total poverty, and they're subsidized by the government. They don't have to maintain family structures, right? You can have systems that should result in failure propped up by government financing. And what happens is you have kids brought up in systems like that, and they're never taught what success looks like.
Well, I'm thinking of a bill I heard is being proposed in California about providing basically universal basic income to a small number of low-income people of color. And when I heard that bill, to me, that's slavery. When you make these people completely dependent upon the state for everything. That's a slave.
There was an old communist analogy for this, and I don't think it was a true story. I think it was an analogy. But this was a popular story in the Soviet Union. They said one day Joseph Stalin was walking around with some of his cadres, and they said, Mr. Stalin, Supreme Leader, or whatever they call him, how do we control people? How do you institutionalize control? He says, watch this. And he reaches down, he picks up a chicken, and he tears out all of its feathers. And he puts it back down, and he hands it a handful of grain. And he says, now this creature will rely on me for all of its needs. You can destroy people's ability of independence. You can destroy the institutions that allow people to have independent life. You can destroy the values that let people go out and build their own wealth and create their own wealth and, fail sometimes, yes, but also be able to rise from failure, right? You can destroy that. And when you destroy it, what you have is a person who cannot survive without the help of the government. And that is what these policies typically do.
I'm reminded of, it was a fan of China Uncensored that I was speaking to one time. And I won't say which country, but he was in a European country. He recently had a newborn baby, but he was out of a job. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry to hear about that. And he's like, oh, the government is basically providing everything. And I was like, oh, okay, so I see why people defend this kind of socialist system. That's great that a family like that can be supported. But then he said, well, the problem is so many people his age don't want to work because the government provides just enough. And once they start to work, suddenly the taxes shoot up and then they have to work really hard to have less than they do right then. And so he was saying that this is a big problem.
And it's true in the U.S., especially where if you have tax brackets, right, where we go beyond a certain income, you get hit with extra taxes. It's actually better for you to be right below certain thresholds. You're going to be better off, typically.
Yeah, I know plenty of people like that. I was, starting a YouTube show. You don't make a lot of money. I knew plenty of people living in poverty, below poverty. And yeah, it was as soon as they moved up to that tax bracket, suddenly they were poorer than they were if they had made less money.
Yeah. And what you have with this then is not just the institutionalizing of failure, right? Because it's better to just be in that state, right? The government's taking care of you and there's no incentive to rise out of it. It's very difficult to rise out of it, first off. Your conditions may be worse if you rise out of it, depending on how deep these policies go, like you just mentioned. And what ends up happening is that they can even make it so that success is not desired, that even the motivation to want to go out and work and basically support the entire socialist state and big government policies is not something you'd actually want to do, right? The motivation for success is then eliminated. And this is when you get into deeper states of communism, deeper states of socialism, where the government says, well, I'm going to make you work. If you go into the old Owenites, the early socialists, even in one of the competing schools of Marx, actually, and you still have these folks, they said that, if the government's going to determine all your life, essentially. And if you choose not to work, you're going to be compassionately killed, essentially,
Well, I think we're pretty far away from that in the U.S.
It's not too far away, though. In China, that's how it's done. The undesirables of the state are eliminated.